All right, so in the two readings for this week, we get back to this fundamental distinction or this fundamental comparison that we've made throughout the term between intellectual property law and antitrust law. Why is that significant, right? One of the reasons it's significant is because of this commercial monopoly, right? I've said this on and on and on, right? What intellectual property law gives you is a state-sanctioned, state-emanating, temporary monopoly over the thing that you get protection on, right? Basically, right, no one can make, sell, or do stuff with your intellectual property for that period. It's a monopoly. You're the only person who can sell it in the marketplace, right, because the government said so. And of course, that way, as I said, you'll make a lot more money. Because generally the two limits to what you can sell are, right, competition, right, because if your competitors underprice you, you'll lose all your customers. The second limit is what customers will pay. Because at some point, right, regardless of how great your product is or, how few competitors you have, at some point, right, you just charge too much money and people aren't willing to pay that for whatever you're providing. In intellectual property law, there's only one limit, and it's the second one because you don't have competitors. And so as a result, it doesn't mean that you can charge whatever you want, right? There's still a limit in terms of what people will pay, but it's the only limit. And therefore, you'll charge more money because you don't have competitors. And making that money, we think, right, is the reason why, the people are incentivized to invent things in the first place, right? Competition is a valuable goal within society, right? Having companies compete, brings down costs, increases productivity, and that's good both for consumers who pay less money for their stuff. It's also good for society more broadly because we do more with less money, and that money can go elsewhere and grow our economy. Right? Another valuable component, right, another valuable social goal might very well be innovation, right? We think that we want people to invent things and that they won't invent things unless they make a lot of money. That's why intellectual property, this competition principle, basically gets out of the way so that we favor innovation at the expense of competition. In fact, by doing the exact opposite of competition. Antitrust is interesting because it is that opposite, right? Antitrust are the rules that prevent people from monopolizing markets. And you saw this American paradigm, which is somewhat different from what we saw this term, right? I made things simple for you this term. I said, why are monopolies illegal? Right? Monopolies are illegal because if you buy out all your competitors, right, then you can jack up the price, and that's bad for consumers, and therefore we don't want people to do that, or companies to do that. The reality is actually far more complex than that, of course. First of all, in that paradigm, what's illegal is not the part where you buy up all your competitors. And that's the salient point that's being emphasized by Professor Kahn, right? Professor Kahn really lays out this consensus within the literature, which she disagrees with, right? And she looks at, right, specifically this principle of consumer welfare. So first of all, to back up, right, antitrust laws aren't very specific, right? They give powers to enforcement agency, in that case the FTC in the United States, to enforce them, but they don't say, right, this is anti-competitive behavior. In fact, the act is about 100 years old and it hasn't been changed since, right? And therefore, these principles are defined in very broad and old terms, and it's very discretionary for the agency to decide what it is exactly that is anti-competitive. And in fact, right, in doing that, it's going to be guided by what various experts think about that. And Dr. Kahn notes that experts thus far have agreed that the significant component is consumer welfare. And therefore, right, we don't want monopolies when it's bad for consumers, and therefore only when it's bad for consumers. As a result, right, in my example of buying up all your competitors and jacking up the price, the part where you buy up all your competitors, the part where you get a monopoly, is generally not the part that's a problem. even though it's the part where you actually get a monopoly in fact, right? The part that's problematic is the place where you jack up your prices and therefore, consumers pay more for the same goods. That is the anti-competitive behavior, and that's why we break up monopolies. But you see, again, this distinction, right? What we're trying to favor is having goods that are affordable, or at least that are fairly priced, not having big companies doing evil things in the market to basically make more money at the expense of the poor regular consumer. And that's the opposite of what intellectual property law does. Intellectual property, limits competition, right? In a very specific context, of course, right? In the context of people inventing things or people, making things that are very personal, such as artwork or books, right? But it limits competition in basically the opposite way. What's interesting as well is how Dr. Kahn, disagrees with that consensus, right? What she says basically is that oftentimes people will get a monopoly, right? She uses the example of Amazon. Companies will get a monopoly, but they won't jack up prices. And that would be fine if we only think of consumer welfare because the consumer isn't worse off, right? For the consumer, it's the same thing. They pay X amount of money for their thing, right, before and after the company acquires its competitors. But Professor Kahn says, right, there might be some other harm to consumers that we don't see, right? And some of what she says you might disagree with, some of what she says I disagree with in terms of, what the normal or the accepted paradigm is, right? But she says basically in technological context, right, it's different. The architecture of the market is different. You make money by being a monopoly, right? It's what we call the network effect, right? Facebook grows exponentially because when you're on there, right, you look for your friends, and therefore you bring 60 friends, and they bring 60 friends, and then everyone's on there. It's almost embarrassing not to have a Facebook account. That's a network effect. It's the same theory that's behind Amazon. Amazon has said, right, first of all, when we build trust, people come back. When we build trust, people know that they can get the stuff from Amazon, and therefore they only look at Amazon. And second, right, we build this technological infrastructure where people know about us in the first place, right, where search engines direct people to us and so forth. And therefore, the economy of that market is such that the reward is, exponential, or at least increases with your market share, unlike traditional markets for, say, milk, right? If you, buy up all your competitors, you might sell more milk, but you don't get exponential returns, or at least it doesn't get more and more, easy to find further customers or to have your existing customers come back just because you have a bigger market share. So Dr. Kahn says, right, that incentive is very strong. It's meant that investors have poured money into companies, right, that don't turn up a profit, that don't raise prices, because the expectation is that eventually they're going to be a monopoly and benefit in a variety of ways. One of which is to have these, what she calls distinct lines of businesses that are mutually reinforcing, and therefore where the company has the potential to make exponential returns, or at least increasing returns with market share. And therefore, Dr. Kahn says there might well be harm to competitors or to customers in some other way than jacking up prices, not because Amazon's trying to hide that it's trying to monopolize the market, but simply because, right, Amazon might very well have an incentive to not raise prices and recoup its investment in some other way. And she argues, of course, that there should be an antitrust enforcement with Amazon for that reason. And it's interesting in seeing how, right, these concepts are fundamental to capitalism and society more broadly, and as they're being applied to a specific context. And even though these concepts pervade capitalism and society more broadly, we see in the case of intellectual property an exception where the law does the exact opposite. What we see as well in that case, right, is that paradigms change. we saw intellectual property law. I think over half of you are going to write a paper arguing that intellectual property has not evolved with the times, does not provide adequate solutions to new problems, right? Either because they're new, or more importantly, because they could not be foreseen when the law was written. When they came up with these concepts, they didn't know that we'd have such a thing as TikTok or the internet or whatever it is. And therefore, paradigms have to change because society changes, because we evolve, right? And we see that being so in intellectual property law, but also in antitrust, right? We see principles that are even 20 or 30, but more importantly, 100 years old, where they no longer meet, they no longer match, or at least that's what Professor Kahn says, no longer match the architecture of contemporary markets in specific industries that could not be foreseen when the rules were enunciated or when the rules were interpreted by scholars and applied by an administrative agency like the FTC.